So my name's Ramona Gönzol, and I'm an associate professor in Romanian language here at SSEES and the convener of the PROLang group. I'm also the academic coordinator language evening class, class program I meant. We offer 18 languages from Southeast, East, and Central Europe, as well as Russia and the Baltic region. We are the only place in the UK where you can learn Georgian language. One of our teachers, Keti Kalandaze, is present here, or will be in a second. And our other teacher, Marina Tigishvili, could not join us today, unfortunately. I now just want to say a few words about PROLang, which is in its third year of existence and thriving. PROLang stands for Policy Research Outreach in the field of language-based area studies, with particular focus on languages of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe and the Baltic region that we cover through our degrees and evening classes. PROLang's aims are to provide a forum for colleagues from the UK and partner universities and beyond to collaborate on interdisciplinary research topics with languages at the core, to interact with policymakers, practitioners, and the public in order to aid and inform wider debates in language-based area studies and cultural, economic, political, and sociological research, to ensure that languages and literatures remain in focus in the post-Brexit landscape, to pay special attention to decolonizing the curriculum for language courses by ensuring minorities of any kind are well represented, as well as to create balanced multiple centers of interest. Sorry, there was an echo. And the last aim is to increase the esteem of SSEES as a global leader in language-based area studies. We will record the event and we'll have wine and Georgian nibbles after the event at the back of the room. So if I could ask the people from the last two rows to kind of bring the chairs or stack them to a side so we have room to mingle. If you haven't purchased the book yet, please do so. You can scan the QR code that you see at the back of the room, that wall, and here under the cover, the poster with a cover. We aim to leave ample room for questions, so please type your questions in the Q&A box for the online audience. Yeah. And in the room, please signal your wish to pose questions by raising your hand. This event has been co-organized with the British Georgian Society, who also provided the food and the wine. Thank you. I'll just wait for the people to sit down and yeah. So tonight we have the pleasure to meet Leo Vardiashvili and talk about his very popular and successful 2024 debut novel, Hard by a Great Forest. I'm quoting from an interview Leo gave to the bookseller. Hard by a Great Forest is a densely layered novel which manages to be several books in one. A picaresque adventure stories, an intimate account of a family torn apart by war, and a tale powered by a central propulsive mystery, that of a father who has gone missing on a trip back to his home country. It is also wildly funny and piercingly sad, often on the same page. Hard by a Great Forest is a novel about Georgia, which illuminates the country's troubled post-Soviet past and the deep trauma of war, but it is at heart the story of a family. The book has already been translated into 9 languages, and I think there are at least 10 more to come. You can see all the covers that have been translated on that poster and again throughout the room. Yeah. Leo was born and raised in the Sololaki district of Tbilisi until age 12. When his family fled the civil war and economic strife of Georgia's post-Soviet regime, his family eventually found asylum in England. English became Leo's third language after Georgian and Russian. 15 years later, he became a naturalized citizen of the UK and could return to the Tbilisi of his childhood, during which time many of his loved ones passed away. Those initial reunions with old friends and relatives helped to inspire and inform Hard by a Great Forest. We also have the pleasure to have Dr. Maya Jagi with us tonight, who kindly accepted the last-minute invitation. Thank you, Maya. Dr. Maya Jaggi is an award-winning cultural journalist and critic, elected a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 2023. She's a contributing art critic to FT Weekend and chair of judges of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, Literature Prize for 2025. She was writer in residence at Writers' House of Georgia and Tbilisi in 2022, an artistic director of the UK's first Festival of Georgian Writers in 2016 and its online sequel at the British Library in 2021 entitled Georgia's Fantastic Tavern. Her reviews of Georgian literature include Leo's Hard by a Great Forest and Haratvili's The Eighth Life in The Guardian, as well as Goderzi Chokeli's Human Sadness in the TLS, Times Literary Supplement. We also have with us Mariam Vekua, over there, a student in history, politics, and economics here at SSEES, also the founder and president of the UCL Students Georgian Society. Online, we are joined by Luca Grigolia, Georgian publisher representing Sololaki Publishing and the founder of Polynomial Books. He publishes predominantly translated fiction and some non-fiction in order to bring previously untranslated authors into the Georgian language, such as Leo. Alena Retova is a professor of African and Afrophone philosophies at the University of Bayreuth, Germany, where she leads a ERC-funded project called Philosophy and Genre, creating a textual basis for African philosophy. Prior to joining Bayreuth, Alena taught Swahili literature and African philosophy at SOAS University of London, which is like 500 meters down the road. A year ago, Alena enrolled in the online language short course for Georgian language here at SSEES, a decision that was to deeply impact her work. She is currently investigating translations of African authors into East European languages with a focus on Czech and on Georgian, and developing a broader collaborative research project that interrogates the nexus between language and epistemic decolonization. Maya, if you agree, I would like to give you the floor to start the conversation.
Thank you very much. Oh, Mike. Thank you very much, Ramona, and I'm delighted to be here and also delighted to see Leo again. I've been asked to say a brief word about this novel in the context of Georgian literature in the UK and outside Georgia. And I do want to be really brief because there's so much to get through and so many people want to speak. You probably all know that only a tiny proportion of books from Georgia's great 1500-year-old literary tradition have so far found their way into English. Since Marjorie Wardrop's landmark version of the medieval epic, The Knight in the Panther Skin, in the early 20th century, there have been many notable translations ranging from Garnet Books and Dalkey Archives series to novels such as Nana Ektemishvili's The Pear Field, translated by Elizabeth Highway, published by Pyrene in 2020, and the book that was just mentioned that I had the pleasure of reviewing in the TLS, which was Goderzi Chokeli's classic Human Sadness, published by Daedalus this year, in a joint venture by the Oxford Georgian Translation Project. But since Georgia regained its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, and particularly since it was guest of honor at the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2018, translations into English have lagged tantalizingly behind those into, say, German. So everything to play for, and I hope that the work that you're doing and other translation groups and language groups are doing will help change that. But this makes Hard by a Great Forest all the more welcome, because besides being part of British literature, which it definitely is, you could argue that it's also a Georgian novel written in English in the Georgian diaspora. And so, Leo, I wanted to ask, the novel takes its title from the Brothers Grimm, Hansel and Gretel, and there's a sense of the forbidden children's stories read to the narrator, Saba, in Soviet Georgia, which are like samizdat fairy tales. You were born in Soviet Georgia in 1983, as we've heard, and I wondered what literatures you grew up reading and in what languages, and also what your own sense is of how much and how little is being translated into English from Georgian.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ramona, for the introductions. I guess the fairy tales and the stories that the main character grows up on in the novel are pretty much my own, really. It was Brothers Grimm, just the old school fairy tales, the pre-Disney stuff, the unfiltered stuff, with murder, cannibalism, and all sorts of good stuff in it. All that stuff is what my grandma used to read me and my mum. I remember being read Alice in Wonderland. I mean, by the time I was born, none of this stuff was really banned, but I've made it banned in my novel because it gives it an air of the forbidden fairy tales. So that's what I grew up on, and I didn't intend for the fairy tales to sneak into the novel, but they kind of did, of their own accord. And when the novel turns out to be a search, kind of going by clues, they started to look a lot like breadcrumbs. And I thought, okay, I'll change the title. The title of the novel was actually something completely different until pretty much I sent it out to the agents. So right at the last minute, I changed it to Hard by a Great Forest, which is the opening of Hansel and Gretel. Is the first line of that fairy tale. So yeah, I mean, I went to the debut, if we want to call it that, of Human Sadness. I have to admit I hadn't heard of that book or that writer, and I loved the English translation. I mean, the name is deceptive, Human Sadness. I haven't laughed. I was laughing out loud on the train on the way down here at the opening of the novel. But it's such a shame that there's so much Georgian literature that's not being translated into Georgian, because there's so much good stuff. I recently went to Georgia to do a few events and take part in the literary festival in Tbilisi, and it's just unbelievable the riches in literature over there that aren't being translated. I kind of want to grab my publisher and say, look, this is a treasure trove here that you can translate, have people read. But yeah, it's a shame. So that would be my summary.
Mariam, would you like to ask Leo a question, because you have some very interesting questions as well?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really delighted to meet you, and I really appreciate you being here tonight with us. So for me, this novel was very special because I think I do have some similar experiences with my parents being refugees from the war in Abkhazia, and me also growing up abroad. So there was a lot of sort of experiences that I personally could relate to in terms of, the search for home. But I would like to ask you first about sort of, as obviously presenting Georgia to foreign audiences, English-speaking audiences, is a huge responsibility. And I would like to ask you about sort of what was your intention, and did you feel any responsibility in terms of representing Georgia in the right way? And in this also context, I wanted to, if you could talk a little bit more about, because obviously the perception of Georgia is also kind of the character's experience of going back home. So if you could talk a little more about that.
Thank you. That's a good question. I didn't feel any pressure about representing Georgia until just now. So thank you for that. No, I did set out to write a story. I had no idea that I was going to try and introduce Georgia to the reader. But that's what it ended up being, because the characters are Georgian, and I wanted to capture the way Georgians speak, the way they think, their sense of humor. So while the facts in the novel might not be correct, like the flooding of the zoo and the animal escape, that's 2015. and the novel takes place several years before that. But I've kind of had to, you know, mess with the timeline. So the facts might not be accurate, but I think I tried very hard to get the Georgian characters right, the way they say things, sense of humor, just the approach to adversity that Georgians have. So that was important to me. So in that sense, maybe it does represent what Georgia can be like. It's a lot safer than it is in my novel these days. There's no escaped zoo animals. But yeah. Does that answer the question, or was there?
I can just add to that. So I'm glad you mentioned the sort of trying to capture the Georgian sense of humor, because I've noticed that a lot of the phrases of the characters, they were sort of directly translated from Georgia. And I'm actually curious about also the foreigners' perspective and whether this was readable by non-Georgian audiences. But since you also mentioned the flooding, could you also comment on the sort of significance of bringing the flooding into this? Because I think that it is something that is not reflected on enough within Georgia, and it's not really remembered enough within Georgia. So I'm curious what's sort of why it sort of brought your attention.
Well, it just happened to take place when I had just started writing the novel, and someone sent me a message saying, look what's happening in Georgia. And I thought, okay, I can't pass this up. This is too good a story to not include in the novel, in kind of life being stranger than fiction. It made for a great kind of surrealist backdrop to the novel, having these exotic animals on the loose in the city. I mean, it was a passing curiosity in Georgia. It was handled quite quickly, I think, in a very Georgian way. I found some details out the other day, in a typical Georgian kind of rumors way, that apparently the tiger was found on the river by people who wanted to skin the tiger. Again, this is rumor. I don't know. I'm just keep hearing stuff about this. And they wanted to skin the tiger. They left it overnight in a kind of shed, came back to it to find it alive, and it got one of them. Again, rumor, allegedly. But yeah, it was a very bizarre time, so it was too good not to include in the novel.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for organizing this event, Ramona and Katie. It's such an amazing event, and I feel extremely honored to be here. I'm just a student of Georgian, so I'm one of the foreigners that you were asking about, how they perceive the novel. Actually, talking about these animals, when I read about the animals, the wild animals roaming the streets of Tbilisi, it made me think of a similar event that took place in Prague in 2002, when there was a huge flood and animals actually, well, many drowned, many had to be killed, and a seal managed to get out and swam all the way to Dresden, where ultimately he died because he was exhausted. So it was a very sad story, but a lot of similarities with this flooding of the Tbilisi Zoo. Now, I would like to ask you about precisely the animals and also about nature. I find an extremely interesting duality, or perhaps three elements in the way you deal with animals and nature. You have domestic animals in the novel, then you have these zoo animals that become wild or disordered, so to speak. And then you have real wild animals, which are or there's the wild forest, where ultimately the characters also wander. And so there is like a kind of three scale of domestication, so to speak, order and disorder. And I find that particularly interesting because you seem to present in the book this domestic sphere or domestication, taming, going wild again. And I cannot help myself but see some similarity there between what is happening with the Soviet heritage, so to speak. So some kind of order / disorder going much more disorderly. And I was also wondering whether, I was actually wondering about animal symbolism. So is this transition from order to disorder somehow related to how you perceive culture, how you perceive the history the transition from Soviet Georgia to independent Georgia and how you perceive Georgian culture. It's I don't know if it makes sense, but I can.
That's a very good parallel, by the way. I obviously didn't include that intentionally to mirror Georgia's kind of becoming a republic in the 90s, but it does make sense. It does add up. It's mind-boggling how a country can go from 70 years of Soviet rule to suddenly being a republic, kind of almost overnight. I mean, 70 years is a long habit to break in terms of just how the country's run, who owns the businesses that were owned by the government. And that is terrifying to me. It's basically chaos. Who owns the factory is whoever gets there first, I think. And this is what played out in Georgia, I think, for the most part, is chaos and people taking what they could by force or by kind of pressure. So it does mirror kind of escalating from, you know, home animals to zoo animals escaping into the city, and then kind of the pure wild animals out there in the in Georgian forests. So yeah, that's a very good parallel, I think.
Quick follow-up question, because for me it's not just 1, 2, but 3, and 3 is the wild nature, which is pure. And I think you also have this presentation of Georgian culture as somehow being very resilient, very close to nature, very pure in a sense. So I was wondering if, you know, if that was the third step, perhaps, or perhaps a kind of perspective for the future, or some kind of return to Georgian culture, or a re-establishment of.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, like I said, I didn't intend the kind of the third level in this to be a reflection of where I think Georgian culture is going. But I was a little bit obsessed with expressing what Georgian culture is like and what it's like to be in a country that's been invaded 30 plus times. As a people, how do you put up with 30 invasions? I mean, Tbilisi has been wrecked and destroyed so many times, and you can kind of see it in the architecture of the city. There's Soviet leftover buildings still in Tbilisi. Then you've got the ancient medieval kind of castles and churches, and then you've got the modern stuff kind of showing through now with touchscreens and giant, you know, advertising boardings. But yeah, it's an interesting parallel. I think Georgian culture is very unique. I heard someone say that Georgia was like the Italy of the Soviet Union, where these kind of passionate, life-loving people lived, and it wasn't just a grey part of the Soviet map.
Anyone else wants to ask a question, or shall I go? So I just wanted to ask you, Leo, what effect writing this novel has on you as a Georgian, well, refugee and migrant, and obviously now, you know, an inhabitant of the UK, very much so. I mean, it's been many years.
So what effect it has on me? I wanted to write because I'm not comfortable being the center of attention. And what's happened is the last 10 months have been me doing these kinds of events in front of a ton of people. So that was the first thing that happened. Also, writing this, I mean, it's partly, some of it is autobiographical in that I left Georgia when I was 12. The main character leaves around the same time. And it's the idea of having to go back home. I went back willingly, obviously, but I kind of forced my characters to go back to Georgia. They don't really want to go back. But the end result, I think, of writing this felt like getting it off my chest a little bit, kind of almost like a form of therapy, right? Because I didn't quite feel at home when I went back to Georgia. It was strange that people would see me in the street and assume I was a tourist. So they'd speak either English or Russian to me, which hurt a little bit because I was like, well, I'm Georgian, what's going on? And then I'd come back here and feel pretty much the same. I'm not quite at home. So yeah, writing the novel was definitely a form of therapy, and I feel like I've got that off my chest now.
Yeah, that was the other question I wanted to ask. So how did you find Georgia? How did you perceive Georgia when you first returned after, leaving from the, back from the UK?
Well, I was too scared to go back alone. So me and my brother went back for the first time. And that was sort of 15, 16 years after we left. I don't want to say it was traumatic. It was nice to see our relatives and friends and stuff and see the country again and the city that we grew up in. But it was testing. It was difficult. It was tough. I mean, we sold our house that I grew up in. So it's a bed and breakfast now, or Airbnb. So it's a bunch of strangers living in there, or a constant stream of strangers. So it was kind of sad, nostalgic to go back, and seeing your relatives kind of having aged 16 years is very strange as well.
And now you're saying that you go back every year. So do you feel more at home now and it's less strange when you go back to Georgia?
Yeah, for sure. My mum lives there, so I do go back as much as I can. And like I said, what writing the novel has done for me is made me feel comfortable being in Georgia. I don't see it as kind of not feeling at home there anymore. I feel like I have two homes now, kind of added UK to my home list. And I'm constantly trying to introduce Georgia to people. So a few people from the publishers went, which I was terrified about. I was like, please don't get in trouble over there and have a good time. But yeah, they love Georgia. Everyone I've taken over there has really loved it.
Hetty, can I ask you, she's there, right? To ask a question that you wanted to ask Leo, because I think it follows quite nicely after him advertising Georgia. But you'll need the mic. Just 1 second. No, because people online do not hear you. People online do not hear you without it. Now.
Leo, I know you speak Georgian as well as you speak English. So, because I teach Georgian here, and it is still a minority language, not many students still, I want you to say what are the advantages to learn Georgian and what these people will have if they learn Georgian. Okay. Sorry.
That's an easy question. Thank you. Georgian's quite tough to learn.
Sorry. What I wanted to ask you, is any Georgian writer inspired you writing this book also?
I'm trying to remember the name. It hasn't been translated, unfortunately. If you've read that book, if you remember that. Okay. I'll find out who the author is. Sorry, what you wanted to know the advantages of learning Georgian. I think learning languages generally, if language is the way we perceive things and understand the world around us, having another language that you speak is a different lens. It's almost a different perspective on the world around you. If you dip your toe in the culture of that language, that gives you another kind of a shift in the angle that you're looking at things. So learning Georgian gives you kind of a unique angle or a perspective on things. Just the kind of cultural things and the sayings in Georgia can be quite unusual. And the same goes for almost any language that you learn or any culture. Georgia, especially with its troubled history, it's a tough language to learn, but I think it's worth it.
Here are some of my students here. They can comment on that.
Yes, absolutely. Just to add that, as a non-Georgian speaker who has asked a lot of people similar questions about what is special about Georgian, I'm told that it's, and you can tell me if this is the case, but that it's a very rich language for literature, a very rich language for writers, because of its enormous vocabulary, partly because of its, you can also tell me if this is the case, also because of its geography, which has made it, the proverbial crossroads, and so many cultures met in Georgia and the Silk Road and so on. But the result for a language is to create synonyms. And there's a comparison people make with Shakespearean English, that because English is such a sort of conglomeration of languages, it's very rich because the nuances between these different words are incredible. So I don't know, you could perhaps tell me if that's the case.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Georgia is a confluence of all sorts of cultures over the centuries, right? Like you said, the Silk Road was right there. Istanbul, Constantinople is right there as well. I can't tell you how much time I spent trying to translate specific Georgian words or sayings into English. And for the most part, I failed, to be honest. I had to kind of expand it into a sentence rather than having just the proverb. So there are so many words that are unique in Georgian that this, again, is one of the pluses of learning Georgian, and you learn so many unusual ways of describing things.
Which one you couldn't translate? Have you got few of expressions or idiomatic things? So many.
I was mostly swearing, to be honest. No, swearing was a big one. F your mother is, one of the kind of standard swearing phrases in Georgia. But it doesn't quite ring the same way in English, does it?
Yeah, like, common one now, they say shemo mecharja and things like that. Kama bina, or this kind of things.
For example, shemo mecharja is basically I've overspent, but the word has an added layer to it. It includes the part that says I did it by accident and I shouldn't have done it. I know I shouldn't have done it. In English, it just says I overspent, as in I spent too much on it. But it doesn't have that extra layer of shit, I shouldn't have done that. Which is really hard to translate. You have to make that into a sentence. You can't just say Shemo Mecharja and be done with it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can follow up on that a little bit. So I read the novel in Czech, in the Czech translation. And precisely the swearing, it's an interesting phenomenon because the Czech translator opted for Russian. She basically, you sometimes have these, expressions about mother and sexual intercourse with the mother. And the Czech translator, so it's in English, in the English text, and the Czech translator used Russian, but in Latin characters. So she basically used, and I think it resonates in Czech culture. It resonates quite a lot. But my question actually is about the translation. So now the book has been translated into Georgian. In one of your earlier interviews with the Radio Tavisupleba, you say that you will become a Georgian author when you write in Georgian. And I would just like to ask how you feel about the translations and where are you at home? Have you read the Georgian translation? Is that home?
The Georgian translation was a lot of fun to work on because obviously I speak Georgian, I can read Georgian. So me and the translator and Luca, I don't know if we got him online. No, Luca, can we hear him now?
Can try.
Okay. Well, between Luca and the translator, Dato, it was a lot of fun. He sent me notes on the first few chapters, and I didn't have any contact with him at this point other than email. And he said, here are some comments. What do you think? And I wrote back to him saying, look, since I speak Georgian and I understand what's going on, can we really go for it and make it as good as possible? So feel free to comment on anything that stands out to you. So he said, okay, give me a couple of days. And then I got an email, which was basically the first 3 chapters just covered in red. Comments, criticism, stuff that I'd missed. So it was great working on the novel chapter by chapter, going through it and making it as Georgian as possible. This is an odd place to be, translating from Georgian into English and then having to translate it back with professional help, thank God. But yeah, it was good fun. But what that made me do is then think, hold on, I haven't had any input into any of the other translations. I hope they're okay. But you've set my mind at ease with the Czech one, that it's okay.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm kind of a little bit nervous about the other translations and how they'll come out, but we'll see. The Georgian one is really good.
So coming back to the question that I tried to ask, how you discovered Leo, how you collaborated with him. Obviously, he started talking about that. And what's the current situation with translations of Georgian literature?
Okay, so I didn't do much, but I had hope because Leo's book is included in the series where we have like a lot of contemporary classics, and we try to cover a lot of international literature. So it was COVID times, and I don't know when this series started. It was probably 2015. I always thought that we could find the Georgian writer in translation because we never had such an experience. So, but you can force things like this, it either happens or it doesn't. So, and then I think it was because of Leo's agent. So we got the email. I got the email. I don't know. I really don't remember how it happened and who put things together, but it happened. And, then one thing led to another. I called Leo. It was winter. And I remember him talking about all this stuff. Initially, I thought that he couldn't speak Georgian. So did everybody else, but now everybody knows that this is not true. He proved everybody wrong when he came to Georgia like 3 months ago. And, he met his reader. He made the new readers, and, it was a beautiful experience. So for us as a publisher, it was, kind of unique. For Georgians, it was second time that stuff like this happened. It was Leo Vardiashvili. Probably you are all well acquainted with her work, and she led the charge as a Georgian writers in translation. We had some others before in Soviet times, but they stand out. Then when after Nino was longlisted for Booker prizes, it was Nana Eptimishvili, which Mai also mentioned, and now it's Leo. So I think for last 5 or 6 years, if we didn't have a lot of momentum before, now stuff happened basically when we were a guest of honor country. We were World Book Capital, UNESCO's World Book Capital. Tbilisi was in 2021. Then Nino happened. Nana's book was translated. One of the Georgian poets, Mariam Vekua, she won a prize for her poetry in UK, and now it's Leo. So we hope that more and more of the literature, which Maya and Leo already talked about, might get translated in following years. So, and what Leo mentioned about the translation, I'm not an editor, but there was a last-minute emergency, and I kind of did a little bit of editing. But I think it was brilliant experience for the translator and Leo, both of them, and everybody won basically. Since it was unusual for us, for Leo himself, for the translator as well. So because not many Georgian translators are pampered with the situations like this when they have to can work on the text, page by page with the author. Sometimes some of the international authors are kind enough to offer that themselves. We had the same experience with Douglas Stewart. We didn't need to exchange emails back and forth, but he was willing to do that. But with Leo, he was Georgian, so it happened. So I don't know. Overall, it was a brilliant experience. It was another milestone for Georgian literature, like a unusual case, of course. And Leo, I'm sure that means a lot for many people, like who were refugees or migrants in the 90s. I've never migrated, but I remember when I was 3, I was sitting on a tank, and this tank delivered me from kindergarten to home, and the stuff like this happened. So we are kind of absurdic nonsense society, and it shows nowadays in our politics as well. So, but that's the other story. Anyway.
Thank you so much, Luca. Sorry, I have to kind of turn off the volume, otherwise there's this huge echo. We'll come back to you, but I just want to follow up with a question, and then we'll start again with Mariam and everyone else who wants to ask a question. And very soon we'll open the questions to the audience as well. So my question is, How was your novel perceived by the people you know, friends and family back in Georgia?
I think they tried to unpick it for stuff from our lives, which there isn't much of it, to be honest. There's some anecdotes from our family and some stories that I heard. But yeah, they enjoyed it. I'm very happy that there is a Georgian version, if only for the reason that I can just give them the novel and I don't have to explain it to them. I'll just say, just read it for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually going to ask that as well, but then I have another question. So, the novel deals with a lot of topics of war trauma, deaths, and loss of loved ones. But at the same time, a lot of the times the characters are dealing with it with kind of humor. My favorite line was when Dimitri was telling the story about how about his family in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Nodar then made a remark that, oh, you have you have relatives in both South Ossetia and Abkhazia. What a lucky person. One foot in each war, exactly. So if you could just talk about the significance of sort of how you dealt with trauma in this novel, because I think a lot of the times, especially among the Western audiences, there's a craving for this sort of like raw like trauma exposure, and a lot of the times it's just a lot of the times what is really appreciated is when it is when trauma is sort of very explicitly exposed in the novels, but you dealt with it quite in a very sophisticated sort of manner, in my view. So if you could talk about it.
Yeah, I think it was a matter of necessity, because the stuff you mentioned, trauma and dealing with, immigrating in general or just being forced out of a country, that stuff is hard to read. And out of necessity, I didn't want it to be a misery memoir where it's just all bad. So I had very consciously had to inject some humor into it. There's a lot of Georgians in the room probably and online. What I've found is that this is how Georgians deal with adversity, is through humor a lot of the time. One of the sayings I heard is that if you can't laugh at it, then it's beaten you. So if you can still laugh at something that's happened, something bad that's happened to you, then you're doing all right. So I saw a lot of that over the last kind of 10, 15 years that I've been going back to Georgia. And I wanted to capture that. And I guess if you're a country that's been invaded 30 times, you need to have a sense of humor, I think, to survive.
Would you like to ask something?
I could. Where shall I go from there? I mean, that's I'll maybe this refers back to something that was asked earlier about the wilderness and so on, but there are a lot of eruptions of rage at the Soviet Union in this novel, unsurprisingly, but echoes of Soviet times, secret policemen torturing detainees in glass police stations that are meant to be transparent. What do you think this sort of perpetual post-Soviet state does to a country, but also the pathologies between people? You said 70 years is a long period, a long habit. But what do you observe that still post-Soviet about Georgia, in a sense, and including on the kind of human level?
I've seen it as not a clash, but a conflict of generations, I think. So it's the older generation that have lived through Soviet times. And then there's the younger generation that has only known Georgia as Georgia. And there seems to be a bit of conflict between the two. And I think it's just a way of thinking. Some of it is expressed in humor. So the older generation might throw a few Russian phrases into their language, and the younger generation, at least in my experience, doesn't seem to like that. And because it's a reminder of that 70-year habit. So I think it's a conflict between generations, and I've seen it within families where family members will bicker about, why are you speaking Russian or why are you not speaking Russian, in any direction. So it's kind of a state of a hangover, I think. 70 years worth of Soviet Union, and now I don't know how long it will take to have Georgia as a unique, identity that's not defined by Soviet occupation or Soviet Union. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to connect to that and perhaps lead it to the level of narrative style. And again, in that interview with Radio Tbilisi, you mentioned magical realism. What I find really fascinating about your style is that you include so many layers of reality. You have dreams, which are real life-like. You have hallucinations. You have voices that communicate with the main character. There are certain novels, for instance, in African literature, where a multiple personality disorder is an expression, a voicing of trauma. So again, we can connect to this kind of traumatic experience, which is described in so much detail in your novel. But your novel, I would say, stays at the level of realism. I mean, every single layer of reality can still be reduced to a kind of realist description, or at least that's how I read it. And I found it really fascinating how you managed to tease out these multiple meanings, and yet you allow the reader to think, okay, this can actually happen. This is not necessarily multiple realities. But I was really wondering, is it just my reading, or especially when you mention magical realism as something that fascinates you, that you like, is that where your book is going? Or do you think, maybe a follow-up question on that would be, do you think that magical realism is a style that is particularly useful or significant for Georgian culture? And I'm now thinking of a lot of films and that really border on magical realism. There is a lot of magic, a lot of symbolism. Yeah, so actually this kind of connection between magical realism and Georgian culture, is there something, do you think?
Good question. I'm not sure that there explicitly is a link between magical realism. I just happen to like that style. I was also very aware of that it's been done to death. And if it's done poorly, then it really doesn't work. But if it's done with care, then it really works. So I wanted to try it out. I enjoyed writing those parts, and bringing it back to it being believable. I think is the part that makes it magical, right? Because if it was fully magical, then it doesn't quite work as well. It needs to be grounded, I think. So yeah, the main character, his voices of the people that he lost in Georgia, that passed away while he was not there. He hallucinates. I think he drinks a lot at certain parts of the novel. So yeah, he does see stuff. But at the end of the day, he's not crazy. It's explainable. It's grounded in reality. So yeah, I think it's just that I enjoyed it. In terms of magical realism in Georgia, I can't really think of any films. Oh, yeah, no, you might have a point there. Yeah, it might lend itself to magical realism. Yeah, Obuladze, yeah, yeah.
And Katie,
so the novel is obviously set in the period of history of Georgia where it's going through a transition, but a lot has changed since then. Obviously, right now Georgia is first of all it's crawling. Tbilisi is crawling with tourists. It's a completely sort of different environment, and I'm curious whether how different the novel would have been if it was set sort of like 10 years after, and how that affected sort of the narrative.
So the novel is set in 2012, which is around the time. No, it's actually a little bit later. So it's around the time that I went back for the first time. There'd be a lot more anger in it if I wrote it now, I think. Like the last time I was there, Luca invited me for the festival, for the literary festival in Tbilisi. Yes, there's a ton of tourists, but they're not really to blame for what I'm angry about, which is so many areas of Tbilisi have just been turned into hotels. It's just trying to capitalize on this interest in Georgia without a care for where you're building these hotels, where these things are being built, how they affect the neighborhood. As I mentioned, the house I used to live in is an Airbnb. There's a bar in the basement that wasn't there before. There's a bar on every corner in Sololaki, which is, it just blew my mind. I was like, is anyone looking after the actual district and what happens to that? So I think there would have been a lot of venting in the novel about that. I would have, yeah, dug my heels in on that. Yeah, yeah.
Kitty? Kitty, do you have a question?
In a second. I don't have a question. One thing to say. Like otherwise, people. Yeah.
I'm much older than you are, Leo, and I was there when all these things happened. Okay, I was in the streets, and then I was followed by the guns, and I don't know, I've seen it, but from my point of view, I don't call it civil war. Okay, and I was a bit disappointed when you called it civil war. Why did you do that?
So.
I guess if you want to be technical about it, that's what it was. That's how it's defined as a civil war. But it wasn't particularly long. It wasn't as bad as it sounds in the novel, I don't think. It's the after effects of it that made so many people leave Georgia in the years that followed. So the civil war itself, or whatever you want to call it, it wasn't what did it. It was the aftermath of that and the Soviet Union and how crazy things got. I mean, I bought some coupons. So coupons were the currency between the rubles and what we have now, which is lari, and it was hyperinflation. So I remember a loaf of bread was something like 20,000 coupons. And the other day I bought 1 million coupon notes on eBay just to see them again, because they look like monopoly money, and they basically were. The prices were going up daily. So yeah.
The gentleman asked this question. Did you like the mic?
Thank you. Firstly, Leo, I hugely enjoyed your book, which I read on my hiking tour in Georgia this summer. But I'm just intrigued by a lot of the comments that are comparing then with now, because making the point that the novel is not a contemporary novel, it's a historical novel. And for instance, I've been going to Georgia over the last 10 years, and really over that time, it's pretty unrecognizable from the societal problems that are in your book. Well, that's my impression. You may say I'm wrong, but I think a lot of comments have been saying that. So, I mean, my question really is, for Georgians, when they read your book, is it opening up a lot of sores? I mean, you know, when they read about what was going on in their country 20, 30 years ago and all the bad things, do they want to address it? Do they want to talk about it in the way perhaps we are this evening? Or is it something they prefer not to talk about and sort of look forward?
I get very much the same or similar questions in Georgia. Similar complaints about how things are described in Georgia. For example, in the Georgian translation, this isn't really a spoiler, but the region they end up in, or the hunt takes them to, is South Ossetia, right? So in the Western world, we know it as South Ossetia, but in Georgia, it's called something else. And just simply calling it South Ossetia is already a political statement with itself, which wasn't really a deal here. None of the English-speaking publishers picked up on this. They just went with South Ossetia, which they recognized from the news. So some tweaks had to be made to the Georgian translation, including there's a lot of explanation on Georgian culture. So the role of Tamada, or head of the table, which doesn't need to be in the Georgian version. And so that kind of stuff was cut out. But for the most part, I think it is a fictional story. So I like to think, and I'm pretty sure most people just followed the characters and the story rather than trying to tie it to something specific politically.
Thank you.
And yeah, Georgia has changed a whole lot in the last 10 years.
And it's less of a question than a comment, but perhaps you could also comment on that. Talking about Abuladze, actually, I think that could be a very interesting connection. I just rewatched on the plane today The Wishing Tree, and there is another motif that, for me at least, connects your book to it, or I see a connection, which is the death of animals, which I found something which was a really shocking somehow feature of your novel, of your narrative. There are quite a few deaths of animals described in quite a bit of detail. There is the hippo, the ostrich, wolves, cow, penguins, and the kittens. So again, we have the whole range of animals. Not the whole range. We have domesticated animals, and we have animals from the zoo. And in The Wishing Tree, the opening scene is the death of a horse, which has a very, I would say, huge symbolical foreboding significance in the film. So it's not really a question. It's just if you could comment on the deaths of animals, or how that somehow adds to the dimension of the animals going wild, or if there is any connection at all. Thank you.
I think you touched upon the right word there, foreboding, which is what the sense of that is what I was trying to build with the animals. I think I hadn't realized how horrible I was to all the animals in the entire novel. Someone had to point that out to me, but I guess I was trying to build this kind of sense of danger within the novel, and it seems killing the animals was a good way to do it. Killing the animals and the magic realism aspect of it. So having witches in forests, it just made Georgia seem dark and dangerous, because the story was taking the characters to a dark and dangerous place by that. So it helped. But yeah, I apologize for animal lovers.
So Luca is saying online that these Cape penguins even made it all the way to Azerbaijan. So if anyone in the room wants to ask any questions, we'll mix it, I think, with panel and audience, yeah? Not at the moment, or online? Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so just adding to what you have commented on, sort of how following the character's line was more important than following the political sort of connotations. But one thing I've noticed is that there was this very strong emphasis on the characters not when talking about the invasion of Samachablo of South Ossetia. They were very explicitly saying that they didn't care if it was the Russians or the Georgians' fault, or who was responsible for this damage. So could you talk about the significance of that? And I can imagine this wasn't perceived very well in Georgia.
I think most people got it. This is Noda, the character talking. He's lost his daughter. So the place he's speaking from, it makes complete sense to say, I don't care who did it. I just want my daughter back. And the whole novel, I was trying to avoid politics as much as possible. In fact, there's hardly anything political in there. And that quote from Nodar kind of encapsulated that, which is to say, I've lost my daughter. None of this is helping me get her back. I don't care who did the what and when. He wants his daughter back. So yeah, I didn't get many comments mentioning that, to be honest. And the ones that I did, there's an easy answer to it. It's the character, and you have to understand what he's going through to understand what he's saying.
So we have a question online, which would be nice if you answer it, and then maybe Luca could comment as well, because it's about translations. Are there any specific contemporary Georgian novels you'd love to see picked up for translation into English at the moment?
I'll have to come back to you on that. I have one, but it hasn't been translated, so I can't. So maybe Luca can tell us if there's any that he hopes will get translated.
I don't publish a lot of Georgian literature. I used to be dealing with authors, but authors are always annoying. Not Leo. He's a rare exception. So I moved to the translation part. For me, the one book I would recommend to get published to any publisher internationally is Zaira Arsenishvili. I will type it in the chat as well. And the book is called Vasopelo. It means like Allah's life. I think the English temple translation is not very good. It will be better and better, but it's not translated into English. But the book is like something that gives life to Nino Haratishvili's books, or something like this Bulgarian writer Vera Mutapchieva, if you know, and just a great Georgian novel. If you call something a great Georgian novel, that is a great Georgian novel. She was a screenwriter, and then, but very humble. Just wrote her her life, and we just rediscovered her after she passed. So she's contemporary classics now, but if everybody could enjoy that book, that would be my choice. It just covers different generations of women in the eastern part of Georgia, in Kakheti region, which is famous for its wines internationally now at the moment. But the book is just, in a category of untranslated literature. But basically, readers who enjoyed Nino Haratishvili would find that it's something else. If they would read Zaira Arsenishvili, it would basically be the godmother of Nino's fiction. Basically, I don't think that anyone who has read Zaira Arsenishvili's work could oppose the idea of it to be the great Georgian novel. So that would be my call on that one. More contemporary writers, I would recommend Tamtam Elashvili, Akamor Chiladze, Anna Kordzaya Samadashvili. I will write, I'm just name dropping here, but I will do the same in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Luca. That was very useful and interesting.
I just have a follow-up question to Luca. I have looked at your website, Sololaki, and there is one page where you have a lot of book covers with English titles. It's the website with the rights. And there are also excerpts from several novels. So I just wanted to ask, are these novels that are about to be translated or have been translated, or what are they actually? What are these books? Because it's like a huge website, at least, I don't know, 30, 50 titles.
That's our rights website. So you could see there a couple of sample translations, and some books have been already fully translated into English, but we don't have a lot of books that made through the English publishers or US publishers or in Australia or anywhere else. So this is just a small rights website representing all our titles in translation. So anyone who's interested, everything's there. And I think the contact information of our editor who handles that is also there. So I'm also here if anyone wants to hear more about this. But you know, that's part of it. It was before last year. We in the last couple of years, Georgian society basically has been struggling with the government, and our government degraded into something else. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but there was a lot of information in English as well on the Georgian National Book Center website. I don't know if the website is still active. I will look it up, but if it's there, you could find any Georgian writer there because they created this for the Georgia, when the Georgia was a guest of honor at the Frankfurt Book Fair. So they tried to cover everything. So I'll just look it up. If it's there, you can find translators, authors, a lot of just small information about anybody. So.
Thank you, Luca. Yes, absolutely. Oh, it's been, yeah.
For anyone who's interested, I did an online festival with the British Library of Georgian writers in 2021, which was the anniversary of the Soviet invasion. And at that time, Words Without Borders partnered with this festival and produced 4 extracts of contemporary novels in English translation by some of the writers who Luca was mentioning. So if anyone is interested, they can find those sort of samples. And the 4 writers were Tamta Milashvili, David Gabunia, Lasha Bugadze, and Archil Kikodze. So that's all on this free website, Words Without Borders, that you can look up.
So anyone else wants to ask a question from the audience? Or panel? Anyone online? Yeah.
Again, it's about like about the animals. It's more a comment than a question, but again, perhaps you can comment on my comment as well. Again, I find really very touching the stories of girls in your novel. There are at least 2 girls, and both of them have been reduced to silence. It's Nino, who only speaks through this inner voice. And of course, she was murdered in the novel. She basically stopped speaking. And then Natia, who stopped speaking as a result of trauma. There are also women who are not silent. So I was just wondering again about this kind of girl presence in your novel, if you would like to comment on that.
Let's start with Nina because she was an interesting character to write. This is a bit of a spoiler, but I think most people have now read the book or not read the book. She dies as a kid during the Civil War, if you want to call it that, by just a freak accident. And her voice is kind of a voice that's been paused, and it only exists in the main character's head. And it kind of gives voice to the guilt for the part that the main character had to play in that death. But it was tough to write that voice because it kind of wanted to head towards Stephen King, creepy child kind of territory, and I had to rein that in to make sure it didn't get as far as Stephen King. And yeah, there's a sprinkling of female characters through the novel. Oddly enough, most of them have passed away, but they do have a strong influence on the main character, and they kind of almost direct the flow of the plot in the novel, especially towards the end, where they kind of almost directly influence what the main character does. So I've had this question before. They said, "You don't have any female characters." I said, "Living or dead," because the dead have a lot to say.
I think that's very interesting. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Katie will take over. Thank you.
I'm really curious to know, with the current artistic flourishing of a lot of Georgian cinema and literature, as your novel being one of the flourishing within this very difficult period in Georgian political history. For instance, Crossing by Levan Akin, that describes the story of a Georgian trans woman trying to survive in Istanbul. And it does surprise me that you mentioned, or the panel often mentions, that there's no connection to the magic realist philosophy within the Georgian sentiment or melancholy. But what about Parajanov? What about an immense amount of Iranian influenced and Pakistani influenced cultural literature and history through The Night in the Panther's Skin? I guess it's not more of a question, but more of a curiosity to take the conversation in that direction, that as well as mentioning gender or patriarchal issues, how can you look at it from the lens of collaboration rather than competition within current society, within Georgian mindset, that it's about collaboration and empathy rather than competition and pushing somebody out in that regard. And it's not a criticism, it's more of a opening of a dialogue.
Yeah, I think we mentioned this earlier about there being conflict between generations. And I hope Georgia does get to a place where it's cooperation rather than forcing someone out. At the moment, it's difficult times in Georgia. And like I said, there is friction between generations and between the various people in Georgia, in fact. So yeah, I do hope we end up in a place where cooperation rules over anything else.
Yeah. So, a decade and a half away from a country is a long, long time. And a lot of immigrants in this country have a hard time reconnecting and rediscovering their culture when they go back home. How much of writing this book was a part of rediscovering your culture and relearning the way of life that your family are used to back home?
I think it was just proper Georgian stubbornness in that I went back. I didn't like how I felt within Georgia, but I kept going back and kept exploring Georgia on my own as an adult, which is a really strange thing to be doing. Having left it at 12, going back as an adult and kind of rediscovering this whole thing and deciding if I like it or not, to be honest. So I've been back almost every year or more than once a year since then. And the novel kind of developed as I was doing that. So I kept constantly adding new scenes, new characters, just new details to the novel because of my travels in Georgia.
Thank you very much for viewing. As Lee said, I'm sorry I haven't read the book, but I did catch up and start this discussion now. Are there any different something gets translated or lost in translation? You get that. There is something which you decided would be appropriate or any small stories?
I'm trying to think. I don't think there was anything huge that I didn't put in that I wanted to. the editing process took a while with this novel because I had two editors. So I had the editor in the UK and one in the US. Where usually you get one editor and that's enough. I had two kind of high profile within their publishing houses editors working on mine. So I'd have two sets of notes to deal with. And the biggest stuff, when they did change big things like moving a chapter from one part of the novel to another, or the last section of the book was written in past tense, and they kind of went, let's make this present tense because it keeps the momentum of the novel. Stuff like that didn't really bother me. They're logical changes that you want to make because they make sense and they make the novel flow. The smaller stuff I struggled with more, where they wanted kind of sentence level changes. I would say this sentence is not grammatically correct. And I'd say, well, no, I wrote it on that way on purpose. It's usually stuff to do with Noda and how he speaks. So yeah, the smaller stuff I found more challenging personally, because it felt like kind of a sanding down effect of your writing to make it grammatically correct. It didn't read as well. So I thought, you know, with the grammatical mistakes left in there on purpose. Yeah. Wow. No, thank you for reading it. And also, so you are Saba, really. You had the experience that he did, landing on the night of. That's amazing. Did you see any animals or no? Yeah. Like I said, truth is often stranger than fiction. Yeah, I don't think it's working.
Hello. Oh, yes. I wondered how much preparation, sort of historical research, you felt you needed to do, or is it the family history that you knew all this stuff, so that you would be truthful to how the events have developed back then? And also another one is, have you visited these places? Because we are probably the same generation, and I've always thought, for example, Abkhaz region, well, I remember from my very early childhood, but haven't been back, and I sort of dream that one day it will happen. Same with Samachal or South Ossetia. So I wondered whether you had a chance to visit and how much preparation historically you had to.
Over the years, I went to everywhere apart from just the border of Samachal. Obviously, I couldn't go up there because that's terrifying. So I've been to all the places that are in the novel, bar that one spot. In terms of research, there isn't much factual detail in the novel, so there isn't kind of years and details and names of presidents and such. So that I didn't have to deal with. But what I did have to deal with is trying to get the places right. So Sololaki, for example, I mean, I was there as a kid, but I had to go back there as an adult, and I have so many pictures from there of random details that I would just take a picture of because it reminded me of something, and I thought I might want to include this in the novel. A lot of that did end up in the novel. and just all the other places that they go to along the way. Just describing the village life, what it's like to be in a Georgian village. I wanted to get that right as well, so I spent a lot of time doing that over the years. So not much research, but different kind of research, I suppose.
There are a couple of questions from online, but if you want to ask a question, no? After maybe, yeah. Okay, so how long it took to write a novel and how the process was influenced by political and cultural changes over time?
I started around the time of the flooding, which is how I remember it, which was 2015. So I think I was on the way in early 2015, and it took 6 years, I suppose, to get it finished. It wasn't really influenced by anything political happening in Georgia. What did have a really heavy influence is my visits back to Georgia during that time, so 2015 to 2021, and now even. I keep finding things now that I want to include in the novel. I keep having to tell myself that the novel is out there now. I can't change it. So that thing I wrote in the notebook on the way home, I'm like, that would have been perfect for the novel, but I can't. It's yeah. So yeah, what that really did have a lot of influences, meeting new people in Georgia and just discovering Georgia almost as a foreigner or as an adult.
And the second question, which part of the book makes you tearful?
I don't know. I'm trying to think of how much of a spoiler this is, but we'll spoil it. It's fine. Nodar almost steals the book, I think, by the end of it. At least from the reaction I've had from readers and reviews, people saying they really hated me for killing him off. But for me, the moment you meet Nodar, he has a target on his back, I think. Because if anyone's going to die and have an impact on you as a reader, it's going to be the person that you like the most. And I mean, that part of the novel has been edited so many times by me that I wanted to get it just right. So I hope it doesn't come across as too sentimental. Some have said it's quite brutal. But that part is probably the one that makes me the most emotional, I think.
You mentioned your notebooks, and that obviously raises the question of what you're working on now and what's next. So, yes.
What I'm working on next is very much looming behind me every day these days. It's not a sequel or a prequel to this at all, but that might happen at some point. But it's actually not set. It's historical fiction, basically. It does have some Georgians in it, but they're not the point of the novel, if that makes sense. So novel 2 is basically almost finished. I've given myself the goal of finishing it by January. I don't know how that's going to work out. We'll see. It'll be nearly finished in January, and hopefully making its way through the publishing process to you guys. Fingers crossed, if it's any good.
I have a little follow-up. So talking about notebooks, take us to your kitchen. How do you work? Do you write by hand? Do you take notes over time? Do you write in impulses? Do you write a little bit every day? How do you work as an author?
Oh, that's a good question. I wrote this novel while I had a day job. Well, I still do have a day job. I'm just on a sabbatical from it. So hence the January deadline. I'm going back in January to be a tax advisor. That's going to be fun. But it took a while to write because I was in a day job and because I had limited time. The way I wrote it was very much sit down. There's no such thing as a muse. You can summon a muse, but you need to be already sat down at your computer by then. Small details and stuff. I mean, I always have a notebook with me to jot things down. Those usually end up on a Word document somewhere. And whenever I find myself stuck, I'll look through that document and see if there's anything in there So yeah, I feel like I'm constantly on record, just observing things around me, really. I mean, it sounds very basic, but yeah.
I'd like to also make a little comment. So the pace of the novel is very alert, and it's full of rich and abundant descriptions, which make me as a reader to be fully immersed as if I was there. It's very visual as well. Any plans? Well, I mean, you wouldn't do it, but would you like it to be turned into a film?
We are actually working on something with a Georgian director and trying to get a script together. So it's in progress. It's obviously it's a story that, or if it becomes a film, it would need to be set in Georgia. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense. One interesting thing I heard from my agent was that, obviously, as agencies do, they will try and sell it to studios. And when they did, almost all the interest was from the US, first of all. And they wanted to change the story to be set in Ukraine. I thought that doesn't make any sense in terms of what the novel is. I mean, they could take the structure, I suppose, and set it in Ukraine, but it would lose the whole point of the novel. But in any case, there is a Georgian production company involved, so we'll see where that goes. Fingers crossed.
Quite a few American films were set in Romania too, so it's random. And could you tell us, from a kind of technical point of view, how do you build a character? So, or at some point, does the character start to have its own life as well?
Yeah, there's a I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but it is a cliche for a reason. It's true. There is a point where you get to with a character where they have their own opinions, and you try and write them into a corner and they won't do it. Like, you know, this character wouldn't say that. When you have that thought, you kind of know that that character is its own person now, so you can move on to other characters. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely found Nodar arguing back with me, and I thought, okay, yeah, he wouldn't do that.
So did Noda protest against you killing him as a character?
I imagine he was pretty pissed off about it, to be honest. Yeah. It was the main character was the last one to come together because I didn't want him to sound like a whinging kind of having everything happen to him character. So to give him some agency took a bit of time. But again, it's a magical thing that happens with characters when you realize that they have a room in your brain, and they live up there and they have their own opinions independent of yours.
I have one on the characters. So I think the comparison that most surprised me of your book with other works was one where Noda was compared to the guides that Dante uses in his writing. Yeah, so I was wondering whether that, because to me that's just off. I don't see Noda. I think Noda is too much of a, he's too complex to be a guide like that. That's how I perceived him. So I wonder, yeah, what do you think about that?
I feel like there was someone showing off, mentioning Dante in a review of my novel. Yeah, no, Nodar is too quirky for to fit that role, isn't he? Isn't he? Yeah, I think he is.
He's not black and white.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I tried to fill the novel with good people doing bad things and bad people doing good things. I was really happy about the detective who at first seems to be chasing this family for no reason whatsoever. Again, it was one of the last things to come together in the novel, this idea of I mean, I always had the worry that he was the iconic bad guy for no reason, just serving the plot. And when it came together, this idea of giving him a reason to be doing the things that he's doing, it felt great. And it kind of rounded him off as a character. He wasn't just in service of the plot, a hollow character.
There is a question online, but I'll just nip in once more. So you've heard and you know very well that, you know, this novel is extremely multi-layered. How did you manage to kind of keep track of all the layers and how they intertwine, or did you sometimes get lost in the maze?
It's fine when you're constructing the maze, but when the editors start pulling bits out and moving them around, and that, you know, the editorial process in general, then it starts getting really confusing. I mean, the US editor went to amazing lengths. She Googled all the villages that I'd listed in the novel and told me that, you know, this village is 4 hours from this village. And in your book, they get there in an hour. What happened? I thought, oh God, okay, this is the level of detail. So when you start pulling at detail like that, it gets complicated. I had a huge diagram for all the characters and all the interactions, so I could keep track of if I was changing something, what else needed to change. Yeah.
There's a question from online. So, what does home mean to you, and where is it? Easy.
It's in Birmingham at the moment. Yeah, I mean, I've been asked this question a few times, and feel like I have two homes. Like I said, I feel 90% at home in Georgia. There's still a bit missing. 90% at home in the UK. So I guess that makes two homes. I wouldn't like to pick between the two, and I don't think I could live here or there without traveling, if that makes sense. So I couldn't live in the UK without going back to visit Georgia for long periods of time, and the same vice versa. It's a weird one.
I'd like to comment a bit. You have a similar.
Yeah, I would say that what you said resonated with me a lot with the not being able to completely feel at home when you go back to your home country, and being looked at as a foreigner. And I guess I'm curious, when you've moved to the UK, what was your sort of experience like before you came back to Georgia with staying connected with the Georgian culture, apart from obviously staying in touch with your family, I guess?
It was a strange experience. We got here in '95. I didn't really speak much English. Got dunked headfirst into secondary school, so I didn't really. I mean, it took all of my attention to deal with that. So I wasn't really trying to keep up with what was happening in Georgia. To be honest, for a long time, I wanted to go back. I wanted to get deported, get back home where I, understood what was going on, had some friends. But I mean, when you're that age, so I was like 12, 13, it only takes a year of being in school until that becomes an all-consuming thing. And then you're starting to make connections, make friends, and then 10 years, 15 years down the line, you're like, okay, I should try and go back to Georgia possibly. What was the biggest reverse culture shock? Just how modern Georgia was by 2012, even, never mind today. But even in 2012, I kind of felt like it would stay the same as I remembered it. And getting there and seeing all this modern stuff, I was like, why is there a McDonald's here and a casino and touchscreen pads everywhere? What's happening? I feel like that stuff followed me to Tbilisi.
Anyone from the room wants to? No? Luca, would you like to say anything else? Just because we don't want to forget about you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, just 1 second. I need to.
Yeah.
Magic here. We can hear you.
Thank you. So, for me, the book, Leo always says that, he tried to bring all these characters, the typical Georgian. Sometimes some things for Georgians might sound really familiar and cliche, but they're not. It's just full of a lot of heart, the whole book. So the humor, basically, and all this decision making as well, because I don't think the Georgian brain is wired. I don't know, the regular way, and that's why we operate differently. And a lot of our understanding of the world also is connected to our colonial past with Russia. So basically, whole 19th century, and when we had like a 3 years of independence after the First World War, then we just had the constitution, we had female MPs, so we had some of the most democratic reforms going on. But in 3 years, Russia annexed us again. So then another 70 years, and it just so it always the thing that always comes to my mind is that James Baldwin talking about the when it was like a Black Lives Movement going on in early 2020. It was COVID, it was everything, but everybody was sharing James Baldwin videos. This, and he always talks about the result of the colonialization is that infantilization of the whole, generations of people, and this never goes away. And in Georgia, we feel the same way. We feel like an infantile. We feel like going against each other sometimes, and it causes us a lot of problems, And but the beautiful part of being Georgian is something that Leo tries to depict in the book, and that's probably the fine line when we find ourselves to be Georgians, basically. So between the absurd and all this colonial past and us, having trouble to grow up as a nation, despite the fact we are the really old one and our language is 27 centuries old and everything, we have trouble to growing up. So I think if people liked Leo's book and what they liked about Georgians, they understood what it is. I would agree that that is something that he just pulled it off. So that's probably one of the biggest things I liked about the book, and I just wanted to put it that way. Thanks.
Thank you, Luca. Sorry, it takes me half a minute. Any more questions in the room or online? Yeah, excellent.
No question. Do we have a bottle of?
Yes, we do. Yeah, I always have a bottle of. Yes. Where's the other mic? Yeah, so.
Can I get a picture of you holding the book? I mean, it's a tradition. Upside down or the right? No, the right way up. That's it. Lovely. Yeah. Oh, right. Good idea. Great.
So we're waiting for the question.
I've got the poster in the background.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so let's go to the question.
So just on a very, again, you mentioned the thing I've enjoyed about this talk the most is the element of healing a moment or a particular moment in a family's history. And I had a very interesting conversation with a painter from South America who studies at Heatherley School of Art. And she mentioned, because, as your brother, she mentioned to me, how does it feel for your brother to have instigated the process of the healing within your individual family? So in an idealistic sense, and on a very rational, real, now, present sense, if you've pushed the button for our family to heal and you've made it so public, does that then reverberate like a stone thrown into the water, into society for other Georgians?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the writing is quite a selfish act. It's getting stuff that's in your head out onto the page. So in that, I wasn't trying to, it was mostly a selfish pursuit of trying to get this off my chest. Like I said, it was a form of self therapy, really. But I hope it does trigger other people to have the same experience and come to terms with the past, just like the characters have to in the novel. I think by reading it, maybe it will nudge you towards having that kind of self-therapy yourself. That would be the hope. That would be the ideal, yeah.
So there's one more question online. Which character in your work do you feel most connected to? Is there a character in your story that reflects aspects of your own personality or experiences?
Oh God, that's a good question. I think the detective is my favorite character. Possibly because I spent so much time on making him not be just one-dimensional. So when I managed to get him across the line and kind of give him a room up in my brain, that felt the most rewarding because it was the most difficult, I think. So he'd probably controversially be my favorite as this guy that's hunting this poor family for no reason. Yeah.
Anyone else? Because we'll slowly approach the end as well. So no? Anyone else from the panel? No? Online? Would you like to say anything else as a last word, and then we'll bring the event to an end? You got a lot of questions. Okay, well, in that case, probably we'll wrap up, and thank you so much, both for the people online and here, for being with us tonight, and for the British Georgian Society for all the help, and all the panelists, and you, Leo. Thank you very much. Hopefully you'll come back with your second book.